What you are about to hear and see is grisly, real grisly. Be warned. 1570 to 71, the Ottoman Turks laid siege to the coastal fortress of Famagusta on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus just south of Turkey. The fort was a strong point on the then powerful Italian city-state of Venice, which at one time had controlled the entire island. Beginning in 1489, the Turks were determined to end the Venetian presence so close to their shores. The commander of the Venetian forces was Admiral Marco Antonio Bargan, and he unexpectedly held off the Turks for months. But by July 15, 71, a massive Turkish fleet of thousands of troops were on the verge of breaking into the fortress and killing everyone within to stop this from happening. Bargan negotiated with the Turks to surrender the city, which was running low on water and food. The Turkish commander agreed that if the city surrendered, all Western soldiers and sailors would be returned home. Unfortunately, Bargan was suspected of killing several Turkish prisoners, and that in addition to holding out so stubbornly for so long enraged the Turks and their commander, General Pasha Mustafa. After getting what he deemed a sarcastic answer from Bargan, Mustafa pulled out his dagger and sliced off the Italian's ear in one quick stroke. Then Bargan's hell began. Mustafa's guard held down Bargan and his other ear and nose were cut off. Then the Turks went mad, killing all Christians in the city. Bargan was kept in a dungeon for 2 weeks while his wounds festered, and he listened to the screams of people being slaughtered. Then the Turks came back for him. They forced him to carry heavy sacks of dirt and rocks around the city walls. Then, when they tired of that, they tied him to a chair and hoisted him up the mast of a Turkish ship whose sailors taunted and threw rocks and other objects at him. Then he was taken to the main square of the city and skinned alive while tied to a column. His skin was stuffed with straw and then dressed in his uniform and paraded around the city on an ox. His body was quartered, torn into 4 pieces, and then given to 4 groups of Mustafa's finest troops as trophies. No, that's not a scene from a horror movie. It all happened. 8 years later, a Venetian sailor stole Bargan's skin from the Ottoman capital Opal and brought it back to Venice. It lies in a place of honor in a church in the city today. That's what happened to an admiral. Imagine the things that happened to disobedient or rebellious slaves held by the Turks. Welcome back. Today we unveil the hidden truths of slavery in the Ottoman Empire. A world of galley slaves, legendary janissary, mysterious eunuchs, and the captivating secrets behind the infamous harems of the sultans. No toilets for galley slaves. If you've watched our videos on the lives of Greek and Roman slaves, you'll know that one of the worst things a slave was forced to be was a galley slave, a rower on a warship. By the time the Ottoman Empire took Constantinople in 1453, the ships by that time, actually called galleys, were powered by both sail and manpower, and were equipped with cannons, making the lifespan of most galley slaves even more miserable. However, maybe a cannonball shell or explosion was preferable rather than sinking with the ship chained to the rower's bench. Making life more miserable was the fact that the slaves chained to the oars and benches in Ottoman ships were often never allowed to leave their place. They slept there, ate and drank their meager portions there, and relieved themselves there too. Slaves essentially rotted on the benches, and in addition to extreme humiliation and comfort, the many cuts and sores on the slaves' bodies made infection and gangrene spread that much faster. And when a slave was used up, his body was tossed overboard. Sharks followed galley everywhere. The life of laborers, claustrophobia, is a relatively new word but an old human condition for some people. Their claustrophobia is debilitating. Cars, hotels, planes, and other closed-in spaces are impossible to deal with. If you've gone claustrophobia, odds are that mining isn't your first career choice or your 1000th. Now imagine this: a slave seized in war, or brought in the slave markets in Africa, the Middle East. And for a long time, the Mediterranean coast of Europe decides he can't go in the mine because he gets terrified in enclosed spaces. He turns and says, "Oh, great Mr. Guard, can I please not go in there? You see, enclosed spaces like tunnels scare me." And then the guard calls some of his buddies over and they bury that slave alive. However, slaves believed to be dawdling at work were given the lash. Slave masters likely used the infamous Ottoman co-op, which is similar to the 9-tail-style whips made famous by the Royal Navy, at least in the movies. So that claustrophobic worker might have gotten a stroke, maybe across the back or chest, or even across the face, and then was sent into the gold, coal, copper, silver, or lead mines with untreated wounds. By the way, enslaved people and even their owners working with lead used their hands and no masks. Death by lead poisoning. After a period of madness or stupidity followed, the dev slaves weren't always taken in combat, bought in a slave market, or born to another slave. They were often kidnapped. The word genocide gets used a lot, and sometimes people think it's overused when not applied to mass killings on a Nazi or Soviet scale. But genocide refers to any sustained act designed to eliminate a particular group of people from the earth or its history. The Ottomans practiced a form of it in their Christian holdings in the Balkan territories of southeastern Europe. In most cases, the Turks did not force people to convert. Sometimes they were given a choice before a siege or battle, like convert to Islam or die. Some did convert. Most died if they didn't win. Some Europeans converted because it made life easier and opened economic opportunities. Some converted from belief, most did not. Christians paid higher taxes. Their economic possibilities were limited, and they were often exposed to mistreatment by oppressive Muslim troops and local governments. They also had to worry about the Ottoman practice of kidnapping European children and raising them as Muslims, turning Europe's children against their parents, so to speak. Attractive young women and girls who were taken more often sent to famous harems of the Ottoman Empire. We'll tell you more about that. In a moment, the boys were taken, raised in Islam, and given intense military training that rivals what you saw in Sparta. In the movie 300, these boys became the Janissary. The Janis were both the shock troops of the Ottoman army and a Turkish version of the ancient Roman Praetorian Guard, an elite force guarding the Sultan and his family, were given special training and privileges that many other Ottoman soldiers were not. They were often given or had the first crack of any spoils of war. Eventually, the Janissary grew into a power unto themselves, and throughout much of later Ottoman history, sometimes held incredible power enough to make or break a sultan. It's hard to understand today, but for centuries all over the world, castration was commonplace. The most famous units were the castrati of Europe, popular from the 17th to the early 19th centuries. A castrato was a man whose testicles had been removed before his voice had changed, ensuring a high voice. But with the endurance of a man, this was done for opera. Sometimes impoverished parents sold the boy with an excellent voice to a music director and the procedure was done. Sometimes the boy had some say in the matter for a time. Some of the biggest celebrities in Europe, especially Italy, were castrati in the Ottoman Empire. Boys, including some boys kidnapped for use in the Janissary, and many educated men were castrated. Some boys sang, others grew up to be harm. Guards, educated men sent to teach or advise the extensive royal family, or the wives of high officials were also castrated. Why castration tends to lower the sex drive, and was believed to increase the focus and mental capacity because a castrated man was thought to think about sex less often, which made them perfect candidates to work. The Turkish word comes from the Arabic haram, which means sacred place. No, get your mind out of the gutter. The sacred place was where the women of the imperial household, from wives to servants and in between, were secluded, kept separate from most of the rest of society, and most men at times in Ottoman history. The harem numbered over 1,000 women and girls. The harem was not a brothel as it was made out to be in Enlightenment Europe, such as in the famous opera by Mozart. The abduction from the harem made up all of the women of the imperial household, from multiple wives to servants. Many of the women were concubines, women kept by the Sultan or male members of his family for both companionship or sexual pleasure or both, but for a variety of reasons, not as wives. It is true that many women and girls taken to the harem were sexually abused or exploited. And while one could say that the women who grew up in the harem had no experience as anything other than a slave or concubine, the truth is they would have had no choice in the matter if they did. It's also true that the vast majority of women taken or brought as slaves in Europe, or otherwise, were not in the harem and lived far more unpleasant lives than the harem. Women were protected from anyone from the outside. The wives, concubines, and illegitimate daughters of the Sultan were given a better education than many royal Europeans in music, art, math, poetry, religion, and much else. Those at the top wanted nothing and were given the finest clothes, jewels, and food. They were also sexual slaves, most having little or no choice as to when and with whom, as concubines were sometimes given as gifts or thank yous from the Sultan to an esteemed guest that said no other man was to touch a woman without the Sultan's permission. That could result in an excruciating death, not just for the man. Remember Bargain, the Venetian admiral. Well, the Ottoman torturers were very inventive. A big favorite was eye gouging, especially with women cutting off noses. Now you understand why eunuchs were given jobs as advisors and tutors to wives and concubines in the row. And while it is true that a eunuch cannot get someone pregnant, and often have trouble performing a little more stimulation, was known to work wonders on some eunuchs' private parts. So who knows what went on when no one was looking. See you next time.